Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. So today I'm going to be sharing all of the books that I read in February. I know we're a few days into March already and I did actually want to film this video over the weekend, but I haven't actually had a chance to sit down and film until now. But I did read a lot of brilliant books over February, so I'm really looking forward to sharing them with you. Let's get started. The Animals at Lockwood Manor by Jane Healey is one of the books that I read in February. It's actually officially published tomorrow, but I read a proof copy this month and I really enjoyed this book. It's set during World War II and it's about a young woman called Hetty who is put in charge of the mammal collection of the Natural History Museum just before war breaks out, and the collection is sent to a huge country mansion for safekeeping, and Hetty is put in charge of this collection, unusually for a woman to be given a role of such importance, but because so many of the men employed by the museum are going off to war, Hetty actually has a chance to try to prove herself with this job. And her job means a great deal to her. She's quite a scientifically minded heroine, which I enjoyed, and so she's excited by this prospect, although of course also worried about the war and worried about her responsibilities at Lockwood Manor, which is the huge house to which the museum's collection is sent. When Hetty arrives at Lockwood Manor, she decides straight away that Lord Lockwood is going to be a very difficult man to deal with. He does have a daughter called Lucy, and Hetty feels drawn to Lucy immediately, and their relationship progresses through the book. Strange things start happening almost as soon as Hetty arrives at Lockwood Manor. The stuffed animals are moved about and one even goes missing very quickly once she's there. And Lord Lockwood just won't give Hetty sort of barely the time of day. He won't listen to her anxieties. He is extremely misogynistic and really quite an unpleasant man. His wife has just fairly recently died in a car accident, as well as his mother, but that doesn't stop him from inviting loads of women to his house and carrying on a lot of affairs. Much as Hetty comes to really dislike Lord Lockwood, like I said, her relationship with Lucy really develops through the book. But this is very much a Gothic novel, and I really enjoyed actually reading a sort of take on Gothic literature, but set during World War II. And I think Jane Healey builds tension so well in this book, and she writes part of it over the year of sort of 1939, when there was the phony war. All of the bombing and so on hadn't started yet, so people were really on tenterhooks, wondering what would happen, hoping that the war might finish very quickly. But so as this tension rises with the characters, so Jane Healey builds the tension of what's actually happening within the very enclosed small world of Lockwood Manor as well. And I thought that worked really well. The house itself is an incredibly menacing presence in the book. It's absolutely huge. It's got over 90 rooms, and Lucy suffers from what they called in those days bad nerves, although it sounds more like PTSD to me because she had some very traumatic the things that happened to her in her childhood, and she still is grappling with those, and she suffers from horrendous nightmares at night. But the house also causes her a lot of anxiety. She feels she has to sort of remember every room and what's in each room, and the house is really used as a kind of metaphor for the mind, and there are so many locked doors and even bricked up doors that are actually found later through the course of the book, and so many secrets that lie buried at the heart of this house. So it's an extremely unnerving place to be, and I just thought that was really well done. It reminded me of books like Jane Eyre. Of course, Lucy's mother originally came from the West Indies, which of course brought to mind the infamous first Mrs. Rochester. And it also reminded me of The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. There's lots of references to a ghostly woman in white in this book, which made me think of that. But also there's a really strong theme of madness, and particularly women and madness, which also made me think of the Wilkie Collins book and how easy it was, you know, for men to be able to brand a woman as mad in those days, and even in at the time that this book is set, and how that was really dealt with and what that really meant. And yeah, there's just so much to enjoy about this. If you like gothic fiction, then I would recommend this one. I read this memoir, Rootbound, Rewilding a Life by Alice Vincent, which I also really enjoyed. This is, it's part memoir and it's part a bit of a history of women and gardening, and sort of gardening within culture. It's also about London gardens. There's a lot to enjoy in this book, but at the heart it is a memoir, and it tells the story of a sort of traumatic, unexpected breakup that Alice went through in her sort of I think her sort of mid-20s, around that age, and how she rebuilt her life after that breakup, and how she really came to terms with herself and found some real strength of character. And partly how she did that was she really developed her love for gardening. And this book is very much about the restorative benefits of nature, particularly gardening, although Alice also draws a lot of inspiration and comfort from the outdoor world generally. And I do love her descriptions of nature, especially of some of the lesser known parks in London, for instance. I really liked that she didn't just write about the really well-known ones like Hampstead Heath or Regent's Park or something. She really stuck to her area of South East London, which I personally don't know very well. So I was really interested to read about some of these lesser known parks, and it really made me want to visit them. She also writes quite a bit about women and gardening and why the study of plants, but also the sort of physical act of gardening, why that was so important to women, and how it was a way for them to get out of the sort of purely domestic sphere at home indoors. So I really enjoyed those snippets of history about gardening, particularly related to women. I thought that was really interesting. And I really liked a point that Alice made in the book too, when she talks about the arts and crafts movement of, you know, like 100 years ago, but how we're actually almost seeing a similar wave right now in all of the artisanal products and businesses that have been popping up so much, and today's fascination with slow crafts and the slow movement generally, but also with nature in design. You know, William Morris, who was such an important figure within the arts and crafts movement, is so back in fashion now. And I found that was a really interesting point to consider too. So yeah, plenty to enjoy about this memoir. This was quite a slim read, but a very impactful one. It's Red at the Bone by Jacqueline Woodson. This story is told through many different perspectives, but they're all sort of members of the same family. The story starts out, I think it's 2001. So it starts in Brooklyn in 2001, and it's a young girl, Melody's sort of coming of age party. She's turning 16 and she has a party at her family's big brownstone house in Brooklyn. She walks down the stairs to the music of Prince blaring, and she looks at her family and friends all gathered to celebrate this special day. But this day is also tinged with real poignancy, because there's a lot of sadness to come in Melody's life, and there's been a lot of sadness before. In fact, the very dress that she's wearing was initially designed for her mother's 16th birthday, but her mother never got to wear it because she found out that she was pregnant at 15 with Melody. This is very much a book about parenthood, and it is about motherhood, but it's also really about fatherhood. Melody is much closer to her father than her mother. She won't even call her mother mum, she calls her by her first name, and her mother has actually been a very absent presence from Melody's life, but her father really took to his role as a parent so much more easily than Melody's mother. It really is a book that's about the societal expectations that are placed on women. I would say it's also about women's ambition. It's about teenage pregnancy and sexual desire and all the ramifications of those things. It's a story about race and class. It looks backwards as well as forwards in time. The story is told through many different perspectives. You get the voices of different members of the family. So some of it is told through Melody's voice, some through her father's, some through her mother's, some through her grandparents, for instance. And I liked, it was like you got these almost like little vignettes of the story in each chapter. They almost could have been little individual short stories, which I enjoyed. And the book also shifts kind of backwards and forwards in time. So there's a really traumatic event that sort of gets hinted at too, and then it happens in the story, and it's really shocking. I won't spoil anything for you, but there is a lot of sadness in this book too. It's also a book about ancestry and your ancestors. So both in a way your family ancestors and your historical ancestors, but I think it also looks to literary ancestors as well. One of the chapters that's told from the grandmother's point of view really reminded me of a poem by Maya Angelou called Still I Rise, and that's one of my favourite Maya Angelou poems. I spoke about this in my recent Tea Reads episode on my podcast, so I'll put a link to that in the description box. Because I sort of quoted the poem and I read aloud a bit from this to illustrate why this book really made me think of that poem. But I thought that Jacqueline Woodson, through doing that, was really referencing literary ancestors and how they impact on your future and your present as well. So I really enjoyed that. But yes, a slim but really powerful book. I highly recommend it. This was one of the first books I read in February. It's Miss Austen by Jill Hornby. We've got the beautiful Waterstones edition. So this one really was a delight to read because it was so beautiful, but I also really enjoyed the story too. Miss Austen is actually about Cassandra Austen, Jane Austen's sister, and it's known that Cassandra Austen chose to destroy a lot of Jane Austen's correspondence after Jane Austen's death. And what Jill Hornby does in this book is she looks at what Cassandra Austen's motivations for that act what they could have been. Why Cassandra Austen decided to destroy so much of Jane's correspondence. And I enjoyed that Jill Hornby's explanation for that wasn't too far-fetched, it wasn't too wildly imaginative. I thought it was very much in keeping with what we know about Jane and Cassandra Austen and their characters. So I liked that. I liked that it felt very sort of fitting, and indeed Cassandra's reasons turn out to be as much that she didn't want certain aspects of her private life exposed as much as she didn't want some of Jane's private thoughts and life experiences to be exposed to the general public as well. But this story starts off when Cassandra is quite elderly. Her sister has been dead for many years, and she goes to visit the Fowle family, who were a family connected by marriage to the Austens. And Jane Austen wrote a lot of letters to Eliza Fowle. Eliza Fowle has just died, so Cassandra goes to see if she can find Jane's letters to Eliza and surreptitiously destroy them without other members of the family becoming aware of her act. I really enjoyed that you actually get a real sense of who Cassandra Austen was through this book. You find out much more about her life, and I really enjoyed that because she's so much in the shadow of her much more famous sister. So I really appreciated that Jill Hornby gave Cassandra a real voice in this book, and it's told through a series of flashbacks as well. So Jane Austen is a character in the book too, and I thought it was clearly well researched, and in general I thought the language was good in depicting, like it was sort of language of the time. I didn't think it was perfect. I didn't think it maybe quite caught the tone of the time. And also there are some sort of fictionalized letters from Jane Austen that Jill Hornby wrote that are sort of scattered throughout the text in this book. And I was a little bit disappointed by those because I think Jane Austen's letters have such a distinctive look to them. She used a lot of ampersands, for instance, in her writing. She underlined words loads. She used loads of hyphens. So they just look a very particular way. And I didn't feel that Jill Hornby really captured that. She did use hyphens and stuff in the letters, but that was really it. And I thought that would have been, in a way, quite an easy thing to do stylistically. And I kind of wonder why she chose not to do that. Because I thought that would have just made those letters feel a bit more authentic. But that was my only real sort of quibble with this story. And in general, I really enjoyed it. And I love that it's about female solidarity and sisterhood as well. This really does a good job at showing what Cassandra and Jane meant to each other, but also how single women generally really came together within a family to help and support each other. So yes, I really enjoyed that. This is another book that I read this month, well, in February. Keep forgetting we're in March. And it's Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Saad. How to Recognise Your Privilege, Combat Racism and Change the World. This is a proof copy that I got, and I was really interested to read this book. It actually started out as a sort of hashtag on Instagram, I think, and a sort of Instagram challenge that Layla wrote about on her blog and her Instagram profile. And it just garnered sort of so much attention and interest that she ended up writing a book about this challenge. And there's just so much of real interest in this book. It's set up in a kind of almost like a workbook. So there are suggested journal entries and sort of prompts to get you thinking all the way through it. And I like that. I like that it really engaged with the reader in that way, because at the very beginning what Layla says is, welcome to the work, basically. And this essentially explains what white privilege is, what that really means, why it's important to know what that means, and it also really examines topics like colour blindness, like tokenism, all of these topics she unpicks really well and helps you to reflect on them. And as well as explaining why it's so important, if you are someone with white privilege, that you know what these things mean, that you address these things that are happening within society, that you take on personal responsibility. So you can't just sit there thinking, you know, I'm not racist, none of this applies to me. She really shows how it actually does apply. And I think this book is a book that everyone should read for that reason. It was a real eye-opener for me, and I'm so glad that I have read it. So yeah, I really, really recommend this one. Then I read A Single Thread by Tracy Chevalier. I'd really wanted to read this book because I was seeing Tracy do a talk about this at an event at the end of February, and I really wanted to get to it and read it in time, and I did. I finished it just the night before the event, so that was good. Really enjoyed this. This is set in the interwar years, I think in the early 1930s, and it's about a young woman called Violet. Her fiance and her brother died during World War I. She's very much still grieving, but she is also considered one of the surplus women who found themselves without husbands or without even really the hope of getting married because of the huge number of men who were killed in World War I. Violet, at the start of the book, decides to move to Winchester to get away from her very controlling and overbearing mother and to try and carve out a life of independence. When she is in Winchester, she falls in with the Broderers, who were a group of women who, and this happened in real life, they did the sort of needlepoint of the kneelers and cushions at Winchester Cathedral. So, as is often the case with Tracy Chevalier's work, she throws in quite a lot of real historical fact into her book, and I found that absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed learning about these women and more about Winchester Cathedral, but this is also such an interesting insight into what it really was like to be a single woman living at that time and just how difficult it was. Violet talks about being hungry so much in the book because she only had one income. Women did not have equal pay in those days. She was barely earning enough to live, barely enough to eat at all. So the hardships that women had to really undergo if they were single was truly appalling, and I think Tracy Chevalier did a wonderful job in showing that. Now, there is romance in this book, but the story does not end the way you might think it would, or that a more cliched story would end. And I just really recommend it. There's also a lot of interesting detail about bell ringing, which really reminded me of The Nine Tailors by Dorothy L. Sayers, which is one of my favourite Lord Peter Wimsey mysteries, and Tracy actually references that book at the very end as one that she looked at in writing about bell ringing. So yeah, just so much to enjoy from this story. I also read Wintering by Catherine May. It says, How I Learnt to Flourish When Life Became Frozen. This was another fantastic memoir. It sort of blended in a bit of self-help guide and wonderful nature writing too. Catherine May is such a skilled writer. That is one of the main reasons why I adored this book. But I also really enjoyed the subject matter. Catherine May writes about the sort of frozen state that the mind and body can go into after stress or trauma or just a really sort of bad period in your life or after illness, for instance. And she compares this state to winter, and she draws inspiration from nature when she looks at the incredible transformations that the natural world undergoes in order to survive winter, in order to survive times of hardship. And I really liked the fact that she wrote about times of wintering as being periods that we should in fact expect to happen in our lives, just as winter comes around every year in the natural world. So it's normal to have winterings of your own, and rather than feeling like a failure or like life is out to get you in some way, you should in fact look at your own periods of wintering as, you know, perhaps she has a good line in the book that's, you can't choose when you winter, but you can choose how you winter. So though you can't change the fact that, you know, life happens, bad things happen sometimes, you can change how you respond to these times in your life. You can learn strategies to help yourself, even if that's just being kinder to yourself. But you can also learn how to become more resilient. And Catherine really looks at resilience in this book as well. She becomes fascinated by the cold. She interviews people who have, you know, lived far north and experienced incredibly cold weather, and how important it is for them to prepare for their winters. You know, they really do prepare for that cold weather, but also what they do to make those extremely cold days go better. So she interviews a lot of experts, people who've wintered themselves, who've overcome trauma, people who are experienced in dealing with the extremes of winter of the natural world, and what those lessons from nature you can actually apply to your own life as well. So it's a really beautiful book. I found it deeply comforting. Catherine May has such a poetic style to her writing. This is a beautiful book just to sit and read. I read it in a single afternoon. I loved all the allusions she makes to children's books, because she loves reading children's books in the winter. You know, that's one of the sort of kind activities that she does for herself, is to read children's books and really enjoy that. So books like Northern Lights, for instance, is a real wintry classic that she enjoys reading every year. I liked reading classic children's fiction in the winter too, so I really appreciated that part of the book. But there honestly was just so much that I enjoyed from reading this. I've also interviewed Catherine May on my podcast. That episode will be going live on Tuesday, March 10th, I think that is. And I'm so excited to publish that episode because we had such a brilliant conversation, and you can see what an inspiring individual she is. But yes, absolutely, I would recommend getting this book if you love memoir, if you love nature writing, and if you want to learn how to become more resilient yourself during hard times, then this is definitely a book for you. And then finally, I read The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby Dare. This is due out tomorrow, March 5th, so this is the proof copy that I have. But I really enjoyed this story. Apparently, Abby was inspired to write it because when she became a mother of, I think, 2 young girls, she reflected on her own childhood in Nigeria, and also that her family, which was a very typical middle-class family, had a young house girl, a young housemaid who worked for the family, and that having a house girl, houseboy was very sort of common practice, and in fact still is in Nigeria. But there are a lot of horror stories about how these poor girls are treated, of sexual abuse, for instance. And so Abby really wrote this book in response to that, and also I think in an effort to spread awareness of this problem and also to change it. So The Girl with the Louding Voice is about a young girl, a 14-year-old girl called Aduni, and she has the most incredible voice. I love the way that Abby wrote this because she really she wrote it so authentically. It's written in sort of broken English that reflects Adeni's limited education, but the language still manages to be so poetic, although Abby never writes in metaphors that Adeni wouldn't use herself. They're always sort of relevant to her life circumstances and to her vocabulary, but they just show her to be such a poetic soul and also so fiercely intelligent. Adeni is desperate to be educated. In fact, all she wants to do is to be able to go to school and to become a teacher. But after her mother's death, she is sold by her father to become the third wife of a taxi man in their village. Through a sort of horrible trauma and tragedy that happens while she's with his household, Adeni is secretly sold and she ends up working as a housemaid at a very wealthy family in Lagos. And there she's really treated appallingly by the mistress of the house. But she just has such incredible strength of character. And along the way, she is actually helped by a number of women who, in the end, help Adeni to really find her voice and to find a way out from her circumstances and to become educated. It's, like I said, it's an incredibly moving story. I mean, there are some really hard scenes to read in the book, but it's so hopeful in the end too. And I just think that it's a really powerful and also very beautiful and moving read. So I highly recommend this one. It's already been published in the States, and I think it went straight into the New York Times sort of bestseller list, which I'm not surprised about because this is truly a remarkable debut novel. So yeah, I highly recommend this one. But those are all of the books that I read in February. I'll put links to them all in the description box down below. But I'd love to know what you've been reading in February. Did you read any of these books, or do any of them catch your eye? But let me know what you've been reading, and let me know what you're looking forward to reading in March as well. But I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Do give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and you can subscribe to my channel by clicking my face that pops up here. But I'll be back again very soon with another video. Bye!